Good evening, everyone. My name is Kevin McCarthy. I'm the director of the Perrot Memorial Library, and I'm pleased this evening to present another in a series of wonderful programs in partnership with the Garden Club of Old Greenwich. This program is being recorded, and we'll have a recording available online tomorrow. We'll send out a message to you all if you've left an email address. It's my great pleasure to introduce Diane Fox. Diane is chair of the program committee for the Garden Club of Old Greenwich, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Kevin. This is Diane Fox, and I'm chair of the Conservation Environmental Committee of the Garden Club of Old Greenwich. And we are delighted to work with the Perrot Library co-sponsoring this particular talk. We've done a couple during the year. We usually do 3. So hopefully you will be able to participate in this one. We will be using the chat room for questions afterward. So I just want to make people aware of that. And we seem to have a lot of participants today, so I will be screening some of the questions at the end. I am pleased to introduce Michael Jastremski, the Watershed Conservation Director of the Housatonic Valley Association. And the topic today is why and how we need to protect our streams. This is a particularly important topic, not just now, today for the Garden Club or Greenwich residents, but for our whole region. And because of the flooding situations that have been taking place, this is even more important today than it has been in the past. And we hope that this talk and this lecture by Michael will give us all some of the information, ammunition, and methods of how to protect our streams and why they're so important, and particularly its impact on the Long Island Sound. And that's really where I think many of us are really focusing on. Mike joined the Housatonic Valley Association as the Water Conservation Director in 2012. His team manages a wide variety of projects related to watershed and stream management, water quality protection, aquatic habitat restoration, environmental education, and river access enhancement. He's focused on the relationship that people and communities have with their streams. And obviously that's what we're wanting to hear tonight. Has a master's degree in landscape architecture with an emphasis in conservation biology and ecosystem management from the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Environment. He's a certified as Floodplain Manager, we need these, through the Association of State Floodplain Managers. Lives in Canton, Connecticut with his son River and their back lab, Tsuga. We look forward to your presentation, Michael, and thank you for joining us tonight. Unmute.
Should I take it away, or
yes, please do.
Of course. Okay. I'm just going to share my screen here. And while I'm doing that, it's a real pleasure to be with everybody tonight. Thank you so much for having me. Again, I'm Mike Jastremski. I'm with the Housatonic Valley Association. For folks that don't know HVA, we're the regional land trust in Watershed Conservation Group that covers the 3-state Housatonic River watershed. So starting up north of Pittsfield, Massachusetts, in the Berkshires, and bringing in a swath of the Berkshires in Western Mass, and then a slice of eastern New York State and Columbia and Dutchess counties, and then another big swath of Western Connecticut, and all that flowing down to Long Island Sound. And again, yeah, great to be here and looking forward to hopefully not just everybody listening to me talk, but maybe get into some good discussion about what the threats are to our waterways, and what can we do to protect them and restore them. So without further ado, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Housatonic River watershed, and I recognize that a lot of folks, this being a Greenwich outfit, are not residents of the Housatonic River watershed, but I think what I have to share has a lot of bearing on Long Island Sound and the waters off of Greenwich. and also the things that I'll talk about as far as threats and the things that we can do about them. That will be applicable for everyone that's lives in the Northeast, I guess, like you could say. So that stuff is fairly general, but I will be using that lens of the Housatonic River, so bear with me on that. And yeah, if there's burning questions that come up throughout, I know we'll be using the chat, so if folks could maybe raise their, well, I guess maybe just punch those in the chat, and if nothing else, we can at least have those harvested for the end when we get into questions. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of Watershed 101. Not really sure if everybody's on the same page with that concept, but essentially a watershed is a landscape feature where all the water that falls upon it ends up in the same water body. And you can think of watersheds as sort of a nested hierarchy. So, for example, you've got the Atlantic Ocean watershed that's draining a pretty significant chunk of the continent. Within that, you've got the Long Island Sound watershed. And then within that, you've got the Housatonic watershed. So this map here is showing the Long Island Sound watershed, and then you can see the Housatonic watershed there on the left in brown, and all that going down to Long Island Sound. Then within the Housatonic, you can split that up into even more watersheds, and that goes even further. So looking at this is actually the 10 Mile River watershed, which is in eastern Dutchess County primarily. We can continue sort of breaking that down, and that goes all the way down to the level of, you could be thinking about the area that's draining to the storm drain in front of your house. So the key idea here is that every part of the land on Earth is part of a watershed and part of many watersheds, and that's an important way for us to think about our relationship with streams. So I'll just say a little bit about the Housatonic watershed. It's about 2,000 square miles, and it covers, as I mentioned earlier, 3 states and portions of 83 towns. So lots of interesting folks to work with for sure, and lots of interesting things going on. There's about 4,200 tributary miles in the watershed, and 149 main stem miles from, again, starting north of Pittsfield, Mass, going down to Long Island Sound. As far as how the Housatonic relates to Long Island Sound, there's a bunch of different interesting things to think about. So it's the second largest source of fresh water to Long Island Sound, second behind the Connecticut, and it's not really a close second. The Connecticut, if you remember that map that I showed you a second ago of the Long Island Sound watershed, is much larger, but it's has a pretty enormous impact on the health of Long Island Sound, especially in that western basin where the Housatonic hits the Sound, which is right near Milford, Connecticut. And the water from the Housatonic circulates through the Sound, and depending on the season and the weather, it's going different directions, but the waters off of Greenwich for sure are influenced in a big way by what's coming out of the Housatonic watershed. So the health of the Housatonic is really important to those waters of Long Island Sound and those waters off of Greenwich. The other thing to think about as far as the relationship of the Housatonic to the Sound is that it's home to historic runs of diadromous fish. So for folks that don't know that term, a diadromous fish is one that spends part of its life in freshwater and part of its life in saltwater. So we're thinking about species like American eel, river herring, if you go back far enough, Atlantic salmon, those kinds of things. So the health of the Housatonic watershed and the ability for those species to get up into the watershed is critical, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I think the take-home part of this is that the health of the Housatonic watershed is really important to the health of Long Island Sound, and particularly that western part of the basin. So what is a healthy watershed? When we talk about that and think about that at HVA, we're thinking about these 3 terms: clean, cold, and connected. So a clean watershed is one where human communities, forests, fish and wildlife, they're all sort of able to do their best, live their best lives, I guess. So pollution isn't preventing them from operating at their best level. Cold is referring to climate change resilience. So there's lots of different impacts from climate change in the Northeast and in the watershed. But one of the things we think about a lot is the contraction of cold water habitat. So, we're using cold sort of as a catch-all for the impacts of climate change and whether a watershed, as far as its health, is resilient to the impacts that are already happening and are coming down the pipe. So that's cold. Connected, there's a couple things we think about here. The first is that fish and wildlife are able to move freely along rivers and streams. So uninhibited by dams, by barrier culverts. Talk about that stuff in a minute. But the other piece of connected is that everybody has access to healthy forests and waters, to healthy rivers and streams, regardless of their background or ability. So it's that sort of human connection to the watershed that is a really important measure of health. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the threats that we see to the Housatonic watershed. And again, none of this is universal to the Housatonic. It's, Long Island Sound watershed wide and even beyond that. But starting with dams and culverts here. So this map that I've got displayed is showing, this is the lower Naugatuck Valley. And then I don't know if folks can see my cursor. Maybe Diane, give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Okay. So I think folks are pretty familiar with the impact that dams have on the ability of fish and wildlife to move back and forth between Long Island Sound and the Housatonic, or, again, talking about diatomaous fish, any sort of saltwater versus freshwater, that sort of movement that they need for their life cycles. In the Housatonic, we've got this is the Derby Shelton Dam, right near Derby, Connecticut. And then the Kinneytown Dam. So the Derby Shelton Dam blocks off the Housatonic River main stem. And then the Kinneytown Dam essentially blocks off the Naugatuck River, which is another, sort of big piece of potential habitat for those species. And the species I'm talking about here, a couple glamour shots of them. So on the left is the river herring, and on the right is the American eel. So those dams are, critically important for us to think about as far as restoring that connection to Long Island Sound for these diatomaous fish species. But one thing that, again, I feel like folks have probably heard a lot about dams and their impact in this this sort of conservation arena. But one thing folks may not have thought about is culverts. So these photos here are showing some culverts that are definitely barriers to fish and wildlife movement, basically on the order of dams. Not a lot of stuff is getting through these structures. And the thing about culverts is, actually, for those who don't know exactly what that term means, it's basically it's a structure that is put in place to carry a road over a stream. And again, a lot of them can be barriers, and there's lots more of them than there are dams. So that's something that we at HVA think about quite a bit. And we've been doing a lot of work to go out there and try to figure out which of them are barriers and work with communities to try to replace them. And the other thing I'll say about it is oftentimes the culverts that are barriers to fish and wildlife movement are also undersized and at risk for damage during flood events, which we're, as we've talked about, getting a lot more of, and a lot larger floods. So I'm just going to run through, just so you get a sense of the scale of the culvert issue, just a little map series here. So this is showing the streams in the Housatonic watershed. So that's about 4,400 miles of rivers and streams. And then if you look at the transportation network, that's somewhere on the order of 11,000 miles of roads, railroads, and things of that nature. And if you think about it, these are two, very long linear networks. So there's a lot of nodes. And at each of those nodes, there's got to be some kind of structure to carry the road, the railroad, whatever it is, over the river or the stream. So just based on there's a lot of field work, but also, you know, based on desktop analysis, looking at the entire watershed in places where we haven't been able to get out, somewhere on the order of 8,000 structures. So that's bridges and culverts. And then the trend that we see after looking at, you know, something around 2,500 structures across the watershed and beyond, is that about 80% of those are going to end up being culverts. And then about somewhere between 50 and 60% of the culverts are going to be some level of barrier to fish and wildlife movement. So all that is to give you help you understand that this is a pretty enormous issue, and one that definitely requires our attention. If our goal is to really restore connection to Long Island Sound for those diadromous species, culverts is something we got to focus on. And looking back at the map I was showing you earlier of the lower Naugatuck, so the Kinneytown Dam here, it sounds like there's going to be some movement on either getting that removed or getting some better passage in there, which will be amazing, because once that happens, there's also been some work up here in the Tingu Dam fish bypass. So once the Kinneytown Dam, there's passage restored there, we're talking about between there and the dam at Thomaston, 25 miles of main stem habitat restored, which is amazing. But if you look at the, you know, predicted road stream crossing structures, the bridges and culverts in that same area, you can see that in order to get passage up into the tributaries, we really have to take a hard look at the culverts and figure out which ones are most important for replacement. And that's something that we're working on with municipal partners and a lot of other folks. So that's the dam and culvert threats. And I also wanted to talk about another key threat, which is polluted runoff. So this is the idea that as water runs off the landscape in a particular watershed, it's, depending on the type of land use, it's picking up various kinds of pollutants. So we could talk about it in terms of urban stormwater, and then I'll also talk about agricultural landscapes and then residential landscapes. But in an urban system, we're looking at things like hydrocarbons from you know, oil and gas and vehicles. We're looking at road salt, which is a real issue, and increasingly so. Also heavy metals, and then nutrients. So when I say nutrients, I mean nitrogen and phosphorus. And phosphorus is a real problem in freshwater systems. Not that it's not a problem ever in saline systems, but primarily in freshwater systems. And then nitrogen, folks have probably heard about the issues that Long Island Sound has with nitrogen pollution. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then also pathogens coming from various sources. So all of that can, you know, going directly into the storm sewer system and thence into our rivers and streams is a real issue. So one of the interesting things is that we're able to, you know, rather than looking at all those parameters that I just listed there, we're able to look at impervious cover sort of as a proxy for what we expect to see in stream health. So there's been a lot of research that's shown that once a particular watershed of whatever size gets the around, I don't know, 10 to 12% impervious cover, that's when you start to really see significant impacts to aquatic life. So we're able to use impervious cover again as a proxy for both understanding whether a watershed is likely to be impacted or not, but also as a way for us to plan projects and plan, you know, sort of plan our restoration efforts, and also track the success of those efforts. So impervious cover is a really great predictor of stream health, and we're able to use that in a few different ways. So this is some analysis that we did a couple years back, looking at somewhat larger watershed divisions in the Housatonic. So take it with a grain of salt. We can slice this up a lot smaller, but it starts to give you a picture of where, based on impervious cover, we expect to see impacts of stream health, and that holds pretty true when we've looked at it in the ground. So these areas in red here, this is the Danbury metro area, it's the Stowe River watershed. And then the lower Naugatuck here, also very urbanized. Then some of these yellow watersheds, the density development is not quite as much as those larger cities, but it's definitely there, and makes sense that they'd be sort of at a tipping point there. And then these watersheds in green, those are generally areas where we have good forest cover. So again, all this is to say that impervious cover is a really good thing for us to be looking at, and a really great predictor of stream health. And then agricultural landscapes, again, there are different kinds of issues there and different potential for polluted runoff. And in those landscapes, we're looking at nutrients, of course. So that could be from often from manure, from various operations. We're also looking at pathogens, potentially pesticides. But generally, we can expect that an agricultural landscape, for the most part, is going to be much better for stream health than a highly developed area. And we're doing a lot of work to reach out to farmers in some of the agricultural areas of the watershed. So it's the map showing the distribution of agricultural land use, and the highest concentrations there along the lower the Housatonic here in lower Berkshire County, and then also over here in eastern Dutchess County. This is the 10 Mile River watershed, and then to a lesser extent down here in southern Litchfield County. And in those areas, the primary concern as far as restoring and protecting stream health is connecting with farmers, encouraging the adoption of best management practices, and that sort of thing, things that are going to reduce polluted runoff coming from those operations. But at the same time, we're thinking really carefully about how we go about that to ensure that we're helping those farms stay farms. We want those farmers to stay in business because, again, agricultural landscapes are generally much better for stream health than highly developed landscapes. And then finally, the third bucket here, and these distinctions are a little bit arbitrary, so bear with me on that, but it's a good way to conceptualize it. This is one that I definitely wanted to talk about with this group, because I feel like this is the place where we can make the most difference. I think if I were to ask everyone to raise their hands and say whether or not they lived in a residential landscape, folks would probably say that they do. I know I do. And that really gives us a lot of agency. There's a lot that we can do on our properties to reduce stormwater runoff, maybe change our land management practices to reduce the potential for pollution to get into surface waters, and really just lots of different things we can do to improve stream health, particularly for the streams that are right next door, that our properties are draining to. And then all of that together ultimately is great for the Housatonic River and great for Long Island Sound, and I'll talk more about that in a few. So just a little graphic here, going back over those three types of land uses. And again, the idea here is to, using these three somewhat arbitrary buckets, start to think about the impact that land use has on water quality. The graphic that's on this slide here is looking at volume. So it's not necessarily indicating concentration of pollutants, but there would be some correlation there. But this is looking at a 3-inch rainfall, and in that agricultural landscape, you're getting about a third of that infiltrated into the ground, which is great for stream health, because that's where the magic happens as far as removing pollutants. you bump that impervious surface up in a residential landscape, and now you're oh, sorry, I said that wrong. The agricultural landscape, we're getting 2 inches of infiltration, so 2/3 is going into the ground where the magic is happening, and that 1 inch is what's running off pretty directly into surface waters. And then when we get into that that residential situation, we're looking more at like, pretty closer to half and half runoff, and half going into the half infiltrating and getting that pollutant reduction. But then we get into a much more urban scenario, and almost all of that water is running right off directly into surface waters and carrying all that pollution with it, with no treatment at all. So again, the idea here is to think about how can we, even if we're living in a space where we have impervious cover, we have these kinds of land uses that, all things being equal, would lead to more runoff directly connected to surface water, and that's more pollution. What can we do in those situations to mitigate that? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So just to wrap up this somewhat depressing conversation on polluted runoff and threats in general. Polluted runoff is bad for the Housatonic, but it's also bad for Long Island Sound, which is, it makes sense if you think about it. This picture on the left here is what's called a harmful algae bloom in Lake Lilanona in Brookfield, Connecticut. So Lake Lilanona is created by an impoundment on the Housatonic River, the Chippewa Dam. And there's a series of these impoundments from Lake Lilanona on down to the Sound. And these harmful algae blooms are toxic to people, toxic to pets, toxic to wildlife, and they also lead to pretty major depletion of dissolved oxygen once the bloom itself decays, and that process sucks a lot of the oxygen out of the water. So it's degrades the habitat in a pretty significant way, and we're seeing more and more of these algae blooms every year, all down the Housatonic, particularly in the impoundments. And then the photo on the right here is a fish kill in Riverhead, New York, and it's sort of the same idea. This is resulting from an algae bloom where, as I mentioned before, same kind of thing happens in the Sound. You get that flush of biological productivity, and then when all of the stuff that grows during that decays, it sucks the oxygen out of the water, and it can lead to pretty dramatic things like this fish kill. But there's all kinds of other disturbances happening even at a smaller scale. So so yeah, the point here is that the polluted runoff that we're seeing from the Housatonic watershed, it's bad locally, and it's also bad for the Sound. So anything we can do to address that is going to be good for both. So yes, okay. Sorry about all the bad news. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the good news. Each of us can make a difference. Like I was saying earlier, we have a lot of agency on our own properties and the spaces that we manage to make pretty significant changes. And if a lot of these are very simple steps, and if we're all doing that to a certain extent collectively, we really can do a lot to improve the health of our local waters, but also the health of Long Island Sound. And there's a lot of help out there. One thing I want to talk about is a program that a few environmental groups in Connecticut developed 6 or 8 years ago, really aimed at helping residential landowners understand some of these simple steps that they can take to improve water quality. It's called River Smart. And the process here is pretty simple. So if you want to get River Smart, you start by understanding your local streams, and then even more so understanding how your property relates to those local streams, and not even necessarily a stream. It could be a wetland, it could be a lake or a pond, but understanding how your property, basically where the water drains and which water it's draining to, and then also thinking about, okay, so what's going on in my property that if I have that water going into that stream or wetland or pond, what's in there, and pollution wise, and what can I do to reduce that pollution? And then those are the simple steps, right? And there's a bunch of those that River Smart provides as a templates and a pledge that really can do a lot to keep again, local waters healthy, the ones that are right outside your front door, and also Long Island Sound. So just sort of very simply, the River Smart thought process is number one, let it go. So the idea here is you're using less fertilizers, less pesticides, setting yourself up to use less irrigation. Let it grow. So you're replacing as much lawn as you can with things like streamside buffers or waterside buffers, you could say, or things like rain gardens. All of these things that A, once it's not lawn anymore, don't require all that maintenance, and B, could potentially be doing some work to filter out pollutants. Using native plants whenever you can. There's a lot of good reasons for doing that. And then also minimizing the amount of mowing you do, and when you do mow, leaving those clippings on the lawn and not carting them off. So, you end up having to replace those nutrients with some sort of fertilizer or something like that. And then finally, let it soak. So traditionally, stormwater infrastructure has been designed with the idea that rainwater is essentially garbage. We got to get rid of it as fast as possible. And we got to turn that mentality around, and we can start on our own property. So keep your rain as much as you can. Don't throw it away. Don't let it just go into the storm drain. Keep that rain around. And of course, there's always going to be drainage concerns and the like, but I think a lot of us could be doing more to make sure that we keep as much rainwater in our properties as we can, and that will do so much to help stream health and the health of Long Island Sound. So just some diving in a little bit here. So limiting lawns and hardscapes. I mentioned this earlier, but if you have lawn that's really not being used for much, and a lot of us do, all we do is mow it. Turning it into something like we see on the right here, a native plant meadow. It's great for pollinators. It's great for habitat for other species. It's depending on the way that water's flowing off the property, it could really be doing a lot of work to filter out pollutants. And if done the right way, thinking about that concept of messy ecosystem orderly frame, so putting a nice frame around it, aesthetically it can be pretty amazing. So that's one thing to think about. Just in general, using native plants in your landscaping plans, but also the native plants that you do have around, making sure you're stewarding those, and doing things like not letting them get overtaken by a lot of the invasives we have around these days, and that kind of thing. So native plants are key. And then if I could choose one thing out of the River Smart pledge that is most impactful for stream health, it would be riparian buffers. Buffers next to water courses, whether that is a stream that's on your property, or it could be a wetland, could be a pond. But there, so much work is done by these riparian buffers, these streamside buffers, to clean up pollution. It's also the water side is where a lot of fish and wildlife, or critters, let's say, spend a lot of their time, whether that's moving through or where they reside. And also, again, that ability for the rhizosphere, the root zone in the soil, to filter pollutants out of the water that's going down to that water body. And then other things like, you know, as trees get larger and put shade on the water, keeping the water cool. There's just so many different things that buffers do. So if you have the opportunity, if you have a stream in your property, say you're mowing up to it right now, maybe reconsider that. And that would do a whole bunch for protecting the health of that stream. The other thing is, you know, going back to this idea of keeping your rain, is trying to put in rain gardens or other practices that are sort of under that umbrella of bioretention. So in this picture here, we're looking at a roof drain from this pavilion. And, you know, probably a lot of folks have roof drainage that's going, you know, into a pipe into the ground and then probably dropping into a, you know, a pipe and going into the storm sewer system. You may have a driveway that's, you know, pitched in the right way where you can capture that water before it gets off your property and goes into the storm drain. There's lots of different possibilities, but the idea is to get that water into some kind of a practice that is holding onto it and allowing it to filter through that rhizosphere, the, you know, the roots and the all of the different organisms that live in the soil. And that does a ton of work to filter out the pollutants that might otherwise get into the stream. So a few more do's and don'ts from the River Smart Pledge. So using non-toxic cleaners and green building materials, do that. Don't flush medicines and chemicals down the drain. Also, don't pour stuff down the storm drain. Even with all the, the things that have been discussed there, you occasionally see that. Pet waste, you know, I know this is definitely can be burdensome at times, but not leaving that pet waste on the ground. Either put it in the trash or flush it. Getting your septic tank pumped regularly if you have one, and then also making sure not to wash your car where that rinse water can go into a storm drain. This is something I saw actually in my neighborhood a couple weeks ago. Somebody rinsing off their car in the street, and you could see, you know, just suds going right into the storm drain and then into the lake that's not far from my house. So so it's, you know, park it on the lawn or bring it to the car wash, but just make sure that rinse water doesn't end up in the storm drain and then in a stream or a river. So I encourage everybody to go to the beriversmart.org website, and there's tons of resources there. I just barely scratched the surface. And while you're there, take the River Smart Pledge. And the idea here with the River Smart Pledge is that if you just choose, you know, 2-3 of these very simple steps, you're going to do a lot of good. And if all of us do that, we're going to do a ton of good. So please consider taking that River Smart Pledge. And again, that's the website on this pledge is actually not right. Use this one, beriversmart.org. And then also my contact information is here, and please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you want to talk more about River Smart, about any of the threats to the watershed. I'd be happy to talk more. And then also, I think we have time for questions now, if I'm not mistaken.
Are you ready for questions, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we have a question from Myrna Hockenbrink. The stream on our property is edged with large rocks. What do you think of that as a buffer?
It's not really a buffer. So yeah, bank armoring like that can have a lot of unintended consequences, I guess. And, you know, often it's put in because you've got excessive erosion in a particular spot. You know, often it's somebody's property, but it's a small stream frontage and they put some rocks in. But then what happens is that removing the ability for the stream to sort of act on that bank means it acts harder on other adjacent banks. And that can sort of unwind really quickly. And then you just, you know, as a system, the stream ends up having a lot more erosion and deposition than it would have otherwise. So yeah, always trying to, if you're dealing with bank erosion like that, Sometimes, depending on the severity, you can get plants in and deal with it that way. Or, maybe even more intensively doing some bioengineering type stuff. But sometimes, if it's really bad, you need to get in there with a machine, lay the bank back, and then plant it after that. So that's a whole separate conversation, but yeah, definitely don't encourage anybody to, consider riprap like that a buffer.
Good point. She also follows with another question. From a policy perspective, what value would a stormwater authority have for municipalities for improving stream health?
Let me say one more thing about the riprap question again, though. First of all, feel free to email me and send me a picture. But one possibility, depending on what's happening with the rest of that stream reach, there are situations where you could plant into a riprap feature like that, particularly like live stakes or that kind of thing, and that can actually do a lot of good. So anyway, not a simple answer. Sorry about that, but
that's a good point. Julie Deschamps asked the question, many of our streams in Greenwich meander through golf courses and then out to the sound. What are your recommendations for encouraging stream-friendly practices at private courses?
I think that's a matter of engaging the owners of the course, and encouraging them to go river smart. Not necessarily easy, especially
with the materials and pesticides and fertilizers that are being used, I'm sure.
Of course, yeah. The way that the landscapes at golf courses, not all golf courses, but many golf courses are managed, it's pretty intensive chemically. And there's, there can be other issues too. So they are great places to try to get this kind of work done. Absolutely.
And would that be river smart as well, to see what kind of products could be used instead of what they're using now?
Yeah, I think a lot of the same concepts that are in the River Smart pledge and sort of all the River Smart materials would apply to that kind of a situation for sure. Yeah, so reducing the amount of fertilizers and pesticides you're using, restoring riparian buffers, trying to capture as much stormwater as you can. All those things would apply.
Mm-hmm. Kara Donahue asked the question, can eels use fish ladders?
Yeah, it depends on the fish ladder, but yeah, eels are actually fairly agile and they can get over a lot of stuff, but not everything.
Well, we have a fish ladder here on the Mianus River. I don't know if they've had eels there, but we know that the fish, we've seen them come up to spawn in the river. Which raises another question. Martina Doshan asked, is there an organization similar to the HBA that monitors the Mianus River?
Yes, I believe there is a Mianus River Watershed Association. Am I wrong?
I don't know. That's why we're asking the question.
I can definitely, yes, I think there is. And again, feel free to email me and I can check back in my contacts, but I'm pretty sure that exists or something. I might not have the name exactly right, but it's something like that. Okay. Also, there's a Trout Unlimited chapter. That would be a good place to go for a lot of this stuff.
Yep. We got some responses with regard to the eels do travel up the fish ladder, which is interesting. So and the Mianus fish ladder was what we're talking about. So that's good information. Another question, does planting along a stream help manage flooding the way wetlands do along the ocean edges?
Yes. The dynamics of that differ depending on the situation. But in general, a healthy forest buffer along a stream is gonna help hold water back and reduce downstream flood heights.
Patricia Adams asked the question, or makes a statement too. We are uphill from an impaired river and practice many of the tips you recommended. But how do we convince our neighbors that everyone needs to be involved?
I guess it depends on the neighbor. You know, it's having these kinds of conversations and, you know, maybe trying to have them around whatever stream it is that's out your front door. If that's something that they care about, that's a great place to start.
I have a question for you myself. And with all of the flooding that's taking place in the heavy rains, and you pointed out about the culverts, of course, but the stream erosion and the scarring of stream banks particularly, what should property owners try to do with regard to that? Because sometimes it's intermittent and sometimes it's more frequent. I know I have a wetland in my yard that flows into a small stream that's near the property here. And my neighbor is not happy with the water going through his yard. We've talked about a rain garden, but I was trying to think of, we want the water to get to the stream so that that's not the issue. It's a question of how do you manage it so that your whole yard doesn't get flooded too.
Yeah, and I think hopefully I said this, but you know, drainage and making sure that you're protecting your property in that way is really important when planning any of these kinds of projects. You know, generally you're trying to think about capturing that's what they call the first flush. If folks are familiar with that concept. So this is the idea that, you know, that first inch or so of rain is generally what has the highest concentration of pollutants. So if you can design a structure to capture that and then have an overflow, you know, some sort of relief valve to get it into the, you know, whether that's into the storm sewer system or into the creek, but that will still do a lot of good, even if you're not capturing, you know, every single flood that comes through. Getting that first flush is what's key.
Important. What species are usually affected first by polluted runoff? What are the canaries in the coal mine type of idea?
So often what we're looking at is the macroinvertebrate community, and it's the Ephemeroptera, Trichoptera, Plecoptera, so the mayflies, caddisflies, stoneflies. And there's lots of different species of those with different sensitivities, but those are the, you know, in the streams that you look at that have this the term for it is sort of urban stream syndrome. But those streams generally have very low diversity. They don't have those EPTs. And you're also seeing lots of species of you know, macroinvertebrate that are very tolerant of pollution. They'll just, you know, often you'll just see tons of them. So like the amphipods, been in a lot of degraded streams that there's just tons of those when we're doing a macroinvertebrate sample. And then, you know, the fish community too. So a lot of the, if we're thinking about urban stream syndrome in that same way, a lot of the cold water stuff, so the salmonids, those tend to go first.
What are your thoughts about local ordinances mandating all new construction to include water catchments and cisterns for brown water use?
I think in Connecticut, for any community that's an MS4 community, that's already a thing.
What is an MS4 community? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that. It's short for municipal separate storm sewer system. So the selection of MS4 communities is based on population density from the census data. And MS4 communities, there's a general permit for all MS4 communities in the state that basically, it's basically looking at their storm sewer system as if it was a pipe coming out of a factory. And so there's a permit for it. And in that general permit, the most recent one was finalized in 2017. I'm pretty sure that there are provisions for including green infrastructure, LID type practices, and new development and redevelopment. again, feel free to send me an email and I can fact check myself, and you can also fact check me.
Protecting wetlands obviously is an important point with regard to the kind of particular first flush. Is there any other, and the rain gardens too, what other recommendations would you have from the standpoint of, like you mentioned about the cold water, maybe planting trees, keeping streams cooler, preventing people from doing embankments, as I call it, wooden embankments along streams?
So when you say wooden embankments, you mean putting in like cribbing,
Railroad
a
ties.
wooden retaining wall of some kind? That
Well,
kind of
railroad ties, we've seen a lot of that.
railroad ties are very bad because they're impregnated with all kinds of awful chemicals, creosote and stuff. So don't put those anywhere near your stream. Just don't even do it. Yeah, just don't do anything with those. In general, it's sort of the same idea as the riprap. You don't want to encroach on the stream's floodplain. You don't want to set it up so the stream is not allowed to, sort of be the stream it wants to be, getting out onto its floodplain and when the water's high, and having room to meander and that kind of thing as big floods come through. So anytime you're putting up a wall or riprap or something like that, if you prevent that, the stream from being able to be dynamic in that way, it's going to have impacts upstream or downstream or both.
Mm-hmm. I know from what people have commented on is that the stream erosion is taking away their property and has put some, structures in jeopardy. And so that's why many of them want to do something about stopping, that erosion problem, not just the flooding.
So, yeah, let me try to address that. So the best way to think about those issues often is to look at the stream holistically, not just your property.
Mm-hmm.
Think about what's going on upstream and downstream, and try to come up with a plan for intervention that incorporates again this idea of the stream has a watershed, upstream watershed that's has these characteristics, and therefore it wants to look a certain way. It wants to be shaped this way. It wants to be a certain size because of all that. And try to, as much as you can, figure out how to accommodate that, because it's a losing battle if you try to get the stream to do something it doesn't want to do for too long. So I try to simplify that a little bit. So I think looking at erosion, excessive sedimentation, what we call sort of generally stream instability, looking at that holistically is the way to go. Don't think about just your property. If you have 100 feet of frontage and it's eroding, you got to think bigger than that.
Easier said than done with some property owners.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm not saying it's easy, but let's just say that's the ideal way to do it.
Yes, gotcha. We've had two pieces of information come through. There is a MyanusRiver.org organization. That's the Myanus River Watershed Council. So they're for people locally. And so people can certainly use that within this area here. Does anyone else have any other questions? I think we've covered most of the questions that came in. If anyone has anything else, please put it forward now, if you could. And I think that, one other quick question, climate change. What do you see happening? How can you predict, of course, but with regard to the water quality and water quantity, but also water temperature as a result of climate change?
So yeah, I mean, I think the climate change is pushing all of our streams sort of in an equal way towards degradation, meaning warmer. That's really one of the biggest things that's moving the needle towards degradation. But also, with additional rainfall, polluted runoff issues can be exacerbated. The stream instability that I was talking about. So, the more the more floods we get that that stream channels aren't adjusted to, once you have something like that go through, when you get a really big ripper of a flood, it'll tear everything up, and it takes, decades for the stream to get back to the equilibrium that it wants. And during that process, there's a lot of erosion and sedimentation happening, which is not good for habitat or water quality. So I think what that speaks to, though, is, I guess I would say there are aspects of climate change that are really difficult for us to control at the local level. There's some level of degradation that's baked into the system, because we're talking about a global phenomenon. So it makes it all the more imperative for us to address what we can address. And, I think starting on our own properties is definitely one thing, but, even scale that up a little bit and thinking about our home watersheds, our home, our towns, and doing everything that we can do to prevent any additional degradation beyond the degradation that we're already signed up for, if that makes sense.
Last question, from a policy perspective, what value would a stormwater authority have for municipalities for improving stream health?
Tons of value. Absolutely. So the idea behind a stormwater authority is that there's a financing mechanism sort of built in structurally to whether that's a tax district or the like, but that funding goes towards stormwater retrofits, stormwater work, and there's lots of different ways that those can be set up. But I think that's one of the things that we're up against, is there's not a lot of resources to get, particularly for retrofits and things that aren't either new development or redevelopment. There's not a lot of resources out there to get those problems addressed.
Where does the stormwater authority exist now that can be used as a model, if any?
There's one in the Pioneer Valley. There's also one in there's one in Connecticut, and I'm forgetting exactly where it is. Again, shoot me an email and I can give me a second to search the web and I can tell you. But there's one in Connecticut that's pretty recent. But there's more and more of them all the time, and I think that's because if they're structured in the right way, they work.
Myra just said that New London has one in Connecticut and seems to be a success story.
Thank you. Yep, New London. Yep, thank you.
Good. Thank you. You can use that as a model.
The other one that I've heard a lot about that's actually been around for a while is Ithaca, New York.
Okay, Ithaca is another model. And last question, is there farming going on in the mouth of the river, the Housatonic we're talking about?
Farming at the mouth of the river in Milford.
I guess it would be near Milford or Stratford or whatever.
Yeah, so not that I know, but honestly I'm not sure, but I don't think so.
Well, I want to thank you.
I don't want to say that. I don't want to say that for sure.
Okay.
Any other questions or questions that I answered but not sufficiently, or was not didn't seem decisive about, definitely feel free to get in touch via the email that's on the screen now.
I hope everybody can see that too. It's mj.hva@outlook.com.
Yeah, and maybe I can put it in the chat too.
Yeah, that would be great. Appreciate that. Mike, we really appreciate your talk today and giving us the opportunity to get a better idea of some of the issues, both broad-based and local, and into the local properties as well. And thank you very much. And it was really excellent, and I really appreciate it's just getting people to act on the questions of pesticides and fertilizers, and that's the biggest problem. That we can try to convince homeowners to tell their landscapers not to use this stuff, we'll be just fine, I'm sure. But thank you so much, and thank you all for participating and your questions, and we look forward to our next lecture, which will be in April. Thanks again, Mike, and good luck with the Housatonic Valley.
Absolutely. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you again.
Glad to do it. Thank you.